Hey folks, Dave Brown back here with the New Populist. Thank you again for joining me. Now, Piers Morgan, of course, is a British TV personality. He hosts Piers Morgan Uncensored, where he has debates on the political issue of the day. Now, oftentimes, these debates turn into food fights, a lot of yelling, a lot of screaming. It's good for ratings to have conflict. But he recently had a debate between Libertarian Scott Horton and General Wesley Clark that was a bit more mature and reasonable. And it was an interesting debate because we got to hear Wesley Clark talk about his opinion on the Ukraine-Russia war. Now, Wesley Clark is famous for a video where he talks about after 9/11 discovering plans where the United States was going to topple 7 different governments post 9/11. And when he came out and talked about it, people gave him credit for exposing the military industrial complex and what their plans were. But when it comes to this Ukraine war, he is 100% on the side of the establishment, on the side of the mainstream foreign policy of Washington, D.C. And in this debate with Scott Horton, I think Scott Horton won. But what I think is interesting is how Wesley Clark tried to defend our actions in Ukraine. Because when you listen to him, you notice that he is very non-specific when it comes to what we can actually do. It's all platitudes. And then he also talks about Vladimir Putin and sort of just exaggerates what Putin's intentions are, or just downright lies about them. Although, in his opinion, they won't be lies, but they just aren't realistic. So I want to play Wesley Clark's answers in this debate and just stop and break down where he says something that I think is a little ridiculous, outlandish, that I think needs to be clarified, corrected, or just have a little more insight added to better explain what's going on, whereas he oftentimes leaves gaps and doesn't really give you all the information that can give you a clear picture of what is going on. So I'm going to play this clip here. It will start with Piers, and I left Piers' part in because Piers introduces this segment by saying a few things that are kind of ridiculous that need to be corrected. So let me start this right now.
Let's move on to why I got you guys back together, because I found last week's debate about Ukraine fascinating. There have been developments since then. Both Donald Trump and President Zelensky, they've both come out now with statements, Scott, about, it looks to me like Trump is desperate to do a deal. He infers that Russia will want to do a deal because of the casualty rate on the battlefield in Ukraine, which is so bad for the Russians now. They're recruiting North Korean troops to come and join them.
Okay, got to stop right there. The casualties are so bad, according to Piers Morgan, that the Russians are recruiting North Koreans to help. That is simply not true. Russia has invited North Koreans into Russia mainly to observe and to learn, because Russia has been fighting this war now for 2.5 years. And over the last 2.5 years, there's been a lot of different changes in how we fight wars. We've seen the introduction of drones and how that has drastically changed warfare. So North Korea being an ally, they have been invited in to observe, to learn new techniques in fighting, primarily. They're not actually on the front lines fighting against the Ukraine or against the Ukrainians in any significant way. If that were happening with all the drones on the battlefield, we would have seen that by now. So Piers saying that North Korea is fighting the Ukrainians because Russia lacks manpower, that is simply not true. And if you look online, and this is sad, there are hundreds of videos of Ukrainian men being dragged away by the military to fight in this war. Hundreds of videos. You do not see the same thing from the Russian side. Now, they would argue, the West, that the reason you don't see this is because the Russians banned that from being shown. Well, so does Ukraine. But people have phones, and the government can't control everything. So if this were happening in Russia on a large scale, there would be recordings of this, and they would make their way online. So the side that is dealing with these manpower problems is Ukraine, not Russia.
Simply can't get the manpower. And the reports that up to 2,000 Russians a day are being killed, which is staggering.
Okay, gotta stop it again. Okay. Up to 2,000 Russians a day being killed. Well, let's do some simple math here. 2,000 a day, that would be in a month 60,000. In a year, 720,000. In 2 years, almost 1.5 million. Now, I don't think he's implying that every day it's 2,000 killed, but even half that would be massive. So if that were the number, 2,000 a day, and let's go with half of it, if there were 800,000 to a million Russians killed, the standing Russian army right now is only 1.4, 1.5 million. And for every person killed, there's usually 3 to 5 people wounded. So Russia would have 5, 6 million casualties right now. That is simply not the case here. Russia definitely has their losses, but they're not dying at the rate of 2,000 a day. That is just preposterous. But the reason that Piers Morgan is saying this is because the whole rationale for us to continue fighting is that we're inflicting so much damage on the Russians that if we just keep it up, at some point Russia will collapse. So they have to maintain that narrative of Russia being destroyed on the battlefield, suffering these losses, so we can't take our foot off the gas pedal. We just got to keep on going.
You also have Zelensky, for the first time in the last week, clearly signaling that he is prepared to do a peace deal and inferring that as part of that, he accepts that Ukraine will have to cede some territory. General Clark, it's interesting. My brother was an army colonel in the British Army for 35 years. And when I went to interview President Zelensky in about the four months after the war began in 2022, and I came back and I said, there is not a chance in hell these guys are going to give an inch to Putin. They're not going to cede an inch of land. And they shouldn't. And we had a very vigorous debate about this. And I said, why should anyone want a Russian dictator to be able to illegally invade a sovereign democratic European country and just take what he wants and kill loads of people in the process? And he said, I'll tell you why. He said, because Putin has sold this to his people, that it was NATO encroachment and the threat of that, which is why he's doing this as a security operation to protect the national interest of Russia on its border. But secondly, he said he has overpowering military might, and ultimately that will mean that Ukraine cannot win this war. And I spoke to him yesterday, and I had to basically see that I feel like he's been proven right. Now, it may not look like a glorious victory for Russia, but ultimately it is highly likely, I would think, unless you think otherwise, that Ukraine is going to have to cede most, if not all, of the territory that Russia has taken, isn't it?
Well, I don't think there's any reason, nor does it make good negotiating posture to sort of advance this at this point. I think if you go back and look at this, first of all, the U.S. intelligence agencies failed from the beginning to really appreciate what was going on in Ukraine. We didn't have coverage. The diplomats didn't understand that Ukraine was a different country than Russia. Most of the people that studied the Soviet Union went to Moscow after the war. They didn't go to Ukraine. They took the Russian view of it. And so we had really sort of bad guidance at the outset. In 2014, the United States basically said, well, Ukraine can't defend itself. Just give up Crimea. We told them to give up Crimea. That wasn't enough. Putin then decided he would try to take Donbass.
So let me stop right there. What he's leaving out, General Clark, is that the annexing of Crimea by Russia happened following the coup that the United States supported that took down Yanukovych. When that happened, they were concerned that they would lose access to their military base, Sevastopol, and that would become, at some point in the future, a place where the U.S. or NATO could land their ships. Now, of course, Russia just wanted Crimea because, not only its strategic importance, but also because most of the people there, frankly, wanted to be part of Russia. So, when they took it over, they had their military guys in place, and then they basically came out into the open and said, okay, this is now part of Russia. And the people there went along with it because, well, they agreed. The majority of people in Crimea wanted to be part of the Russian Federation. That's why it was taken over so easily. And I believe no one was killed. It was bloodless. Again, because the people there wanted to be part of Russia. And then he says, General Clark, that Putin wasn't satisfied. He wanted the Donbass. Well, no. There was an 8-year civil war between the Russian speakers and the ethnic Russians in the Donbass fighting the Ukraine government that was now pro-West and supported by the West. That went on for 8 years, and there were multiple attempts by Russia, by Europe, to have an agreement where those two provinces would be part of Ukraine. They wouldn't leave. They would have some autonomy and some protection for their language and culture, but ultimately they wouldn't be part of Ukraine. It wasn't until 2022 that Putin said, okay, I've tried to settle this. Now we're going to do it the hard way and come into Ukraine. So there's a big gap there between 2014, when Russia took Crimea, and later when Russia went into Ukraine because of the situation in the Donbass.
When I was over there on the 31st of March, 1st, 2nd, 3rd of April of 2014, Ukrainians came to me and said, we have 50,000 people. We stayed in Dnipropetrovsk and Zaporizhia. We held those against the Party of Regions, which was the Yanukovych's party, the Russian party there. We defended it. We fought for 30 days. We stayed. We wouldn't let them have the administration. So there was a widespread effort. The United States really wasn't engaged in it, didn't understand it, didn't have much to do with it, really. Victoria Nuland sort of spoke out of turn. She got chastised for that. Obama was trying to use Putin to help with Iran. And suddenly this thing, pops up like, what the hell? We had already outsourced our foreign policy in Europe essentially to Angela Merkel. Angela Merkel, in the way the Europeans do, they sort of blunder in, let's all get together and share our interests. And of course, Putin is a geostrategist. He's not an economist. He doesn't care about trade. He wants territory. And from the time he became the president in 2000, he wanted to take over the space of the Soviet Union. He still does.
Take over the space of the Soviet Union. Really? How, by the way? The Soviet Union was massive. There is no real indication or evidence that Putin wants to take over the space of the Soviet Union. Now, one thing that Putin has said is that the tragedy of the collapse of the Soviet Union was that it sort of scattered the Russian people around, in the wind. There are Russian people now in other countries outside of Mother Russia who are essentially stranded and no longer part of the country. And that's, what Putin called a tragedy. And the Russians in Ukraine would be a good example. Being outside of Mother Russia, being subject to Ukraine, and then 2014 happens, and then there's this ethnic battle between the Ukrainians and the ethnic Russians. So that's what Putin, again, said was a tragedy, that the Russian people, after the fall of the Soviet Union, were not all together. And I guess now, with this war in Ukraine, those Russians in Ukraine will be reunited with Mother Russia. So no, Putin does not want to take over all the space that the Soviet Union had. Even if he wanted to, it's impossible. It's ridiculous. So Why Wesley Clark says that, I don't know.
So there've been a lot of misestimates, and I wouldn't quote Mike Mullen or Mark Milley, although they're both good men. They weren't there. They weren't on the ground. They didn't see the intensity of the Ukrainians' resistance. As to what happens now, I think there's still determination in Ukraine to stay and fight. This is about whether there's going to be a Ukraine or not. Now, Putin does believe he's going to win. There's no doubt about that. He thinks that, and he's not going to say, oh, okay, I'm ready for negotiations because I've lost a few troops. This is Mother Russia. They lost half of Russia to the Germans. They still won. So he is fully engaged in this. And this is going to be the great challenge for Donald Trump. If he wants to make America great, he can't do it by sacrificing Europe, because Europe is the geostrategic prize that both Russia and China crave. And Europe is there for the Americans right now. Now,
two things here. One, he talks about the fact that the Russians, even when they battled the Germans, despite the fact they took tremendous losses, they were resilient and eventually won. And he's pointing out the situation in Ukraine is somewhat similar, and that Putin, thinks they're going to win, and he thinks that these new provinces are now part of Mother Russia, and that they're going to fight no matter what it takes. So he's kind of admitting that, Putin's locked in. The Russians are committed. So what is your plan then? I say this to anybody. How do you beat the Russians in this situation that does not involve direct NATO involvement? Simply arming Ukraine and giving them weapons is not enough. They don't have the manpower to continue this war in perpetuity. So there is no real plan to beat the Russians here. Again, the only way we could possibly do this is if we had direct involvement, but that potentially could lead to nuclear escalation, as you have two sides with nuclear weapons. And if one side gets desperate, well, that's the last resort. And then he says that Trump can't give up Europe to the Russians and China. I wasn't aware that Europe was dangling there, apparently without any agency. And if it's not for the United States, well, they'll be just taken away by the Russians and by China. I don't quite get that. That sounds a little paranoid to me, although he kind of says there that, well, Europe is for the United States. Not for Europe, it's for us to dominate and control so that the Russians or the Chinese don't. I wonder what the Europeans think about that.
may not want to think in terms of geostrategy. Most Americans don't, but most of the rest of the world does. And so I think when Donald Trump is speaking, and I heard him speak on the last interview he made, and he talked about NATO, he sounds pretty strong. I think he's going to recognize that he's going to have to find a win-win solution out of this.
Right.
And it can't simply
be no win-win.
that we abandon Ukraine. Putin wants all of Eastern Europe back, and he wants the rest of Europe neutralized. And look, Europe...
He wants all of Eastern Europe back. Again, I'm not sure how Putin would do that if he wanted it. It's taken them 2.5 years, and they still haven't even taken over the Donbass completely, the 4 provinces, or the oblasts. So I don't know how that happens. Again, this sounds to me like just the paranoia coming from NATO and the West to make Putin seem like this monster.
It has population, it has technology, it has investment resources, it has markets, it's everything that China wants, and it's also what Russia wants, and it wants us. So if you want to be the great leader of the world, to take what's there that we already have. We have to find the ways through this, and so I wouldn't start by saying it's inevitable that Ukraine has to give up half its territory or something like this.
It kind of is, actually.
Let's let the reinforcing forces go in. Let's not talk to...
What reinforcing forces? What are those specifically? Manpower? Ukraine doesn't have it. So what are these reinforcing forces? Again, they never actually tell us what they're going to do specifically to change what's happening in Ukraine and for Ukraine to get back territory. They just say these things that are vague and very non-specific because they don't have a plan.
Defeatism at this stage. Let's not let Putin talk us into the inevitability of Russian victory? It's only inevitable if we believe it's inevitable. And that's all his work. He's got agents and people who will carry his talking points all through the West, every country. And believe me, in every country in Europe, there are people who will say, if Ukraine falls, don't worry about it. Don't worry. We can deal with Putin.
So again, we're people are carrying Putin's talking points in the West. I guess that would include people like Tulsi Gabbard, RFK Jr., or anybody who recognizes reality in Ukraine. If you do that, you're carrying Putin's talking points, and you're signing off on this inevitability of a Russian win. Again, it's called being real. I'm not saying you give it all away, but if you're not being realistic, you can't have an actual diplomatic solution. Both sides have to have have to be realistic to sit down and figure something out.
Somebody we can work with, and this whole thing, and that's Putin's plan. He doesn't want a military aggression in Europe. He doesn't want to use nuclear weapons. He's an intelligence guy. He wants it to fall to him, and he's good at it. He's the senior statesman in the world today. He knows what he's doing. So he's gonna dangle opportunities for President Trump. He's gonna make it seem like, well, if you give us Ukraine, I'm sure we can work together against China. Or it's gonna be like, if you give up Ukraine, I'm sure we're gonna be able to solve the problem of Iran in the Middle East, and so forth. He's playing big picture stuff. It's not just about Ukraine. Ukraine's just a chip on the board as far as Putin is concerned, and we have to think in the same scale.
I think that's an interesting admission there. There's all this talk about protecting liberty, protecting freedom, and he says, Ukraine, it's not about freedom and democracy. It's just a chip on the board for Putin, and it should be the same for us, a chip on the board. Well, that chip on the board has lost hundreds of thousands of men fighting the Russians. And you'll never hear people like Wesley Clark ever acknowledge the loss being suffered by these countries that we use as chips. It's pretty cold-blooded stuff, actually. And but if you're a neocon part of the establishment, well, you got to be pretty cold-blooded.
And at the same time, just as Scott's saying, we're worried about terrorists too. That's irrelevant. What's relevant here is how you want to shape the future of Europe for the United States' best benefit. And if you believe the best benefit is to simply accede to Russia's supposed superiority, then I can show you all the documents in which Putin has said he wants one space from the Atlantic to Vladivostok. And if you look at the December 2021 documents, he wants the neutralization. He wants NATO rolled back to pre-1997. He wants the countries in Eastern Europe out of NATO. He wants to reestablish control over the Baltics. And as the generals in Moscow told me in 1995, when we were going to put the first NATO force into Bosnia, he said, "You're coming into our part of Europe." And there was never any question about it. And it's not just Putin, it's the way Russia thinks. It's Russian imperialism. So
coming into the Russian part of Europe and it's Russian imperialism, we have a similar thing. It's called the Monroe Doctrine. When the Soviets were in Cuba, we said, you're coming into our part of the world. You need to get your nuclear missiles and get out of here. We have this double standard when it comes to force projection. When we do it, it's benevolent. It's a defensive action. When we put our NATO bases closer and closer to Russia, when we put new bases in the Philippines, closer to China, that's a defensive measure. If there's any response from China or Russia in any similar fashion, well, that is imperialism. That's aggression. So we have this double standard for what we do and for what Russia and China do, and it's a little annoying.
Balkans is their part of Europe. They're working very hard right now with Mr. Vucic and Dodik in Republika Srpska to cause problems there and make difficulties for the Dayton Peace Agreement, which Richard Holbrooke and our team helped negotiate and bring to a conclusion. And so, yes, they have ambitions. And if you talk to the people in the region, they understand this very well, that it's not just about Ukraine or Moldova or Georgia. Just over the weekend, people from Georgia are calling me and said, you got to help Georgia. I mean, they're taking over. They've got about 20% of Georgia they occupied after 2008. They move the markers about 100 meters every 6 months or a year in Georgia and challenge the Georgians to resist it. And Georgia wants to be part of the West. That's why there's hundreds of thousands of people demonstrating. And yet, if the West is silent, if we don't use our influence there, yes, Putin will take it. It's not what people want. And so it comes back to, how do you view the role of the United States? Are we a nation that can try to help others reach what we have and what they aspire to? Or are we just an historic anomaly that should shrink back in and say, oh, thank goodness we're protected by two oceans? Because we know those two oceans don't work anymore. They work.
So, real quick on Georgia, certainly in Georgia, there are people that are more pro-Russia and people that are more pro-West, and that is another one of those battleground countries where both sides seek influence. But one thing we've done in the West is that we've funded a lot of money into places like Ukraine and places like Georgia, and recently they had a law they were trying to pass that would make it so that if a media source received 20% of their funding or more from outside of Georgia, they had to declare it and state it that another foreign entity was giving them money. And there was a huge uproar about this in the West, and we attacked that law in the West, saying that it was anti-democratic, it was anti-free speech. But ironically, we have a very similar law. We don't allow foreign governments to invest money in media companies to push their side in the United States. But we do the exact same thing to other countries. When other countries try to block it, we call it undemocratic and anti-free speech. So, Georgia had that law, and Russia and China themselves have similar laws because they understand that if they don't, there's going to be NGOs funded by the U.S. government that will be working in those countries to push for democracy and undermine the governments there. So this is not to say that it's good or bad to push for democracy sometimes, but it's when it's done with the idea of undermining a government, well, that government has every right to respond to that, and we do the same thing as well. So using our influence is fine, but if it's done in a way that's underhanded and really looking out for our own interests, then I might have a problem with that. So Georgia, it's a very tricky situation there. Again, they're stuck in that gray zone between the United States, Europe, and Russia, and that's a very dangerous place to be, as we see with Ukraine. If you're stuck there in the middle, you end up getting crushed. So Georgia is another country we have to keep our eyes on to see what happens in the future.
For a long time, if you want safety and security, if you want our values, if you want democracy, you have to be able to have a foreign policy that reaches out with all the elements of national power beyond the borders of America. If you want to make America great again, as Donald Trump says he wants to do, he's going to have to face the fact, as H.R. McMaster said the other day. Look, it's not just Russia, it's not just Europe, it's Iran, it's North Korea, it's China, it's Russia. They work increasingly closely together to confound and disrupt and reduce America's influence in the world. And that's bad for everyone in this country.
So that really sums up the idea or the thought process of the establishment, that we can't be confined to our borders. We have to project power, because if we don't, another force will project their power that will at some point infringe on our own. or come to our borders. So we have to be in this constant state of, in my opinion, outward projection and aggression. And he says that Russia and China are working together. Well, Russia and China were, always had problems between each other. It wasn't until recently, when we blew up that pipeline and we're working to really put a wedge between Russia and the rest of Europe. It's only recently that Russia and China have worked more closely together. So if we found that an alliance between Russia and China was a dangerous thing, well, we are in large part responsible for that happening. Putin, people don't realize this, is pro-Europe. He's actually, compared to some people in his country, moderate. He wanted to be integrated with Europe. It was the West and the United States that essentially didn't want this to happen. We've always had a real problem with Putin. We like Yeltsin. We've always had a problem with Putin because Putin is a nationalist, and we've never fully accepted him. And we've always been working to undermine Russia, and it's a wet dream, an absolute wet dream of the neoconservatives to cause the collapse of Putin's government. That's what they ultimately want. That's what they thought they would get with this Ukraine war. Unfortunately for them, they were wrong. It didn't cause that. Although with the fall of Bashar al-Assad in Syria, there are some people in the West who are thinking, see, we finally got Assad in Syria. If we just push a little harder and wait it out, perhaps we can get Putin in Russia. But I do not think that is going to happen.
I'm sorry about Afghanistan. I'm sorry about Iraq. I'm sorry about all the military men we left over there that died over there, the mistakes that were made by the Pentagon. I wasn't there. If I had been, I think it would have been different. But, most of these mistakes that have been made by politicians. And in the case of Ukraine, President Obama never understood it. He outsourced our foreign policies to Germany. He was facing toward Asia. They didn't get it. President Biden, I would have counseled, and I tried to counsel publicly, when you meet Putin in Geneva, tell him no. Tell him you're not going to be able to advance. We already knew in the spring of 2021 that he was planning to attack Ukraine. We could have said to him, go into Ukraine. We're going to do everything we can to stop you, and we will stop you. Instead,
what does that mean?
We said,
what would we do?
We hope you'll be a gentleman and a statesman. That's not using American power. I hope Donald Trump, and I think he does, understand the use of power. You have to use power in this world. And we're coming to, it's what Xi Jinping told Putin a year and a half ago. He said, change is not seen in 100 years, and we are driving it. Well, we've had 75 pretty good years since the Second World War. If we like the world as it's emerged, if we rule of law, if we like travel, if we like relatively corrupt-free government, relatively open opportunities to express differences of opinion, then you're going to have to stand up for those values and fight for them, because you're not going to have them in China or Russia, or if China and Russia have control over the United States.
If Russia and China have control over the United States, I'm not sure how the hell that happens, but I'll end it there. But and just commenting on the last thing he says there about sorry about Afghanistan, Iraq, blah blah blah. He's basically saying, oh yeah, look at all of these disasters. Sorry about that. If I had been in charge, maybe that wouldn't have happened. And if I had been in charge, we would have done more in Ukraine that would have prevented Putin from invading. And he says, everything's been great the last 75 years. Well, in the United States, sure. But our foreign policy, again, has been an absolute disaster. Started with Vietnam, going into Iraq 1 and 2, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria now. I mean, it's been an absolute disaster. But, and what's the response of how we, what we need to do in the future? Power, power, power. Use power. Well, haven't we been using power the last 75 years? And where has that gotten us? So he has no real specifics on how we actually interact with Russia and China other than to be a bully and say, Putin, you can't do this. That doesn't really, do anything. And Putin's going to go, okay, whatever. And he's going to go off and do what he's going to do. So, he's very non-specific and vague with how we actually settle this conflict, how we actually push back against our enemies or perceived enemies. But one thing you don't hear him say is, how about we sit down and actually have some diplomacy? That apparently never occurs to these people, that we could actually have our people get together and find a solution that where not, you don't get everything you want, but you get enough where you can put your weapons down and have some peace. So I hope Trump can do something when he becomes president, but there is, a gigantic mess waiting there for Trump. Syria, Israel, Palestine, Ukraine, Taiwan. He has a challenge ahead of him, and I'm trying to be optimistic that he can do something, but sometimes, no matter what you want to do, things can be outside of your control. You can only do so much, and Trump can only do so much. So we'll just have to wait and see if he has any magic, and if he actually can find a way to bring this Ukraine-Russia conflict to an end, because that would be fantastic. Well, that is it for now. If you are new to my channel, please like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.